Hi, my name is Shelley Grafstein, and I am the host of How to Parent Your Teens Through Difficult Times. And what I did was I made an online conference bringing in experts in various capacities who specialize in issues our kids are confronting in this day and age, issues that some of us never had to deal with, issues that some of us dealt with in the periphery, but they're much more prevalent. And today's guest is Tallii Rosenbaum, and she is one of my neighbors, a very special lady. And Talli is an individual and couples therapist, a certified sex therapist. She's a podcast host and an accomplished author and an avid walker, I may add. And so I'm really uncomfortable with this topic. I've already warned her I will start blushing, and I already see in the reflection I'm blushing. So I'm going to probably turn into a tomato, but that's okay. So Talli helps empower moms to speak openly with their kids about sex, which I have to admit, my youngest is 18, and I probably did on a scale of 0 to 10 talking to my kids about sex. Maybe I am up towards the 1. Okay, like we kind of like avoided this whole issue of sex. So do you have any idea, Talli, of how many kids in the I guess we'll keep it into like the religious, whatever that means, the religious group, kids that are having premarital sex?
Before I address that very important question, first of all, thanks for having me on. It's great to see you in this forum. Usually we meet each other walking out in the field. I also am kind of happy that you exposed your discomfort talking about sex and talking about sex to your kids. I think that you more represent the norm, although I imagine that there's quite a spectrum, but I think that you're not alone. And many people are, first of all, it's helpful to me that you remind me that there are people who are not comfortable talking about the thing that I talk about all the time, but also that parents have difficulties communicating, even parents who communicate well with their children about all sorts of topics. When it comes to this topic of sex, they just don't know, they just have not sufficiently been taught the words to communicate about it, or just feel awkward being able to answer questions or bring up topics. And I think it's very common, and I think that we can certainly normalize it, but at the same time, look for ways to be able to do this comfortably. Because what I would start with is your question. Your question is, do I have an idea of how many on the religious spectrum kids engage in sex? And of course, when you say sex, that's also very, very broad. I mean, sex can be anything. And these days, sex isn't even just the way we think of sex as touching and all that. Sex can be sexting, and sex can be cyber sex, and sex can be all sorts of things that can be done online. And so there's a wide range of experiences that our young people can have. And I think that the salient question isn't so much how many kids are doing it. The salient question, or I think it is important to know that their sexual activity exists out there. And I think that that's always been the case. Everyone has known that. I think the important question is how do we talk about it? How do we offer information? How do we ensure safety? How do we ensure autonomy and consent, boundaries, birth control? I think that it's not just about let's make sure our kids aren't having sex, because as you said, there are kids who do, but it's about if they choose to, how are they making those choices and based on what? So this is what I'd be happy to talk more about.
Awesome. Okay. And it's funny, I grew up secular until I was 30, and premarital sex was just part of everybody's life. You turn 16 and that was it, which makes it even that much more interesting that I'm embarrassed to talk about it with my religious kids. So it's anyways, it's interesting. I can even imagine, I'm thinking Clovel Homer is someone who grew up religious, it must be that much more difficult. So
Yeah, that's interesting. Although I grew up religious and I seem to have no trouble talking about sex.
yeah,
So go
yeah,
figure.
go figure. Yeah. Okay. So I guess a question that comes to mind is having these discussions and making sure our kids are prepared with birth control and knowing if how to prevent a pregnancy, I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Is it giving them permission to have sex? Like, what's the fine line between talking about it and not giving them our blessings to do it?
That's a very common question. I mean, I think first of all, we would need to acknowledge that sex education encompasses a lot more than birth control. I think that first of all, sex education is about values. And part of our role in educating our kids is educating them in accordance to the values that we want them to be able to integrate into their lives. Now, I think that part of the reason why you're having this whole program is that, as you know, you may know, and you work with this, not all kids choose to follow the exact values of their parents, and being able to navigate that and continue having, a meaningful relationship with your children is part of the challenge for many, many parents. And this can be true around sexuality as well, that
Mhm.
children or adolescents or young adults may not necessarily adapt the same system of values. But that's the thing. If your teen or your young adult child is able to articulate their values around sexuality, what is the meaning for them of sex? Why do they choose to engage in it? What do they believe about sex? Then they are probably far more prepared to engage in sex in a safe, respectful way than kids who are doing it in a way that is, of course, not in accordance to our values, but we're doing it anyway. And
Mhm.
then you ask, well, why? And in what way are you doing it? So the question about, do we empower kids to have sex by talking about these things? I mean, I think that some of the research on this tells us no, because the research that has been done on abstinence only sex education that was very popular in the 1980s, let's say, there were far more unwanted or unprepared for pregnancies when sexual education was only about abstinence.
Hmm.
So, like, as the saying goes, in order to say no, you have to know that,
That's cool.
if you don't if you don't really get any sexual education, the chances are that you will have sex, but you will have sex not necessarily from a place of choice or consent or autonomy. That's the real problem here.
Wow.
The real problem is that things happen, and they don't always happen first of all, they don't always happen in a completely sober state. Often these things occur when there's also alcohol or weed or other substances around. And so you're not always in your best frame of mind to make your best decisions. And then if you're not in your frame of mind to make your best decisions, and you're not necessarily present, things may go further than you had wanted. And so you're not able to make the boundaries that you want to make. And this is where things can happen that you're not necessarily protected for. Not only protection from pregnancy, but protection from sexually transmitted diseases or illnesses that, when mature adults choose to engage in sex, they are meant to think about these things in advance. Do I want to sleep with somebody unless I know what their, history has been, or that they are free from any kind of herpes or
Gosh, yeah.
any other kind of thing? So there's a lot to consider. Sex is not just a recreational activity. It has a lot of meaning, and we want our kids to be able to talk about what is the meaning for them. There's a big difference between a kid who's looking to, just to kind of have an experience, or to be popular, or to feel like they need to keep their boyfriend, or, these kind of experience, or, two young adults who are not married yet, who, have talked about these things, are mature, and they choose to say, look, we're still religious. We know that this is the halacha, but we're not ready to get married, and we're choosing to do this. And some women, young women, might say, and I'm even going to go to the mikvah, but I'm not going to get married just to do this. I mean, there's all sorts of levels of how to talk about sex or engage in sex in a way that's ethical and responsible, and it may not necessarily be in accordance with Jewish law or in accordance with the values, but there are choices that we make in life with a lot of other things too.
Everything, yeah.
May not be completely in accordance. So the idea that, oh, if you're going to do it anyway, just do it and don't think about it, that's dangerous, because that's when things can get out of hand. People don't like to hear this. People think that, okay, if you're going to do it, it's because you weren't thinking, and nafaltem, it's better to think about, oh, it just happened, I wasn't strong. But actually, I think that people should take responsibility for the decisions that they make.
Yeah, probably all decisions. So what age would you suggest parents have? I know it's Tallui on the kid, but what is like the oldest age parents should have this discussion with their kids?
Well, there isn't just one discussion.
Or start the deeper discussions, I guess.
Well, look, the question about age, or when do you say this, or when do you say that, sexual development is like development. It's just a part of development, just like there's cognitive development and spiritual development. Like, you don't say, when do we talk to kids about Hashem, and when do we talk to kids about, it's just part of the whole progression of development is, you teach your values, and you grow throughout the process. So they're really, sexuality is one. You start with sexuality when you're a baby, because for babies, it's identifying their body parts, right, and also recognizing that it feels good when they touch them, and also having the conversations about privacy, and not using infantilizing terms for body parts that are the genitalia, using real words and not ignoring that they're there. And in just the course of life, if there are going to be curious questions about, mommy, why is that lady's belly sticking out, or how did the baby know to get in there, and being able to address those questions in an age appropriate manner for that child's age and that child's cognitive skills and abilities at that point, but always basically leaving the door open. This is an area, it's like any other area. If you have any questions about it, please feel free to ask me. We're open, we'd love to hear about it. We'd love to answer your questions. Now, understanding too that when we don't talk to kids about sex at all, or if the sexual messages are only very negative, like don't do this, don't do that, they will look for information. And I think where they'll look for information.
Yeah, this for sure, the street.
But not just the street. They'll look online. They will go to porn.
That was actually going to be my next question. If online porn has affected these discussions we're supposed to have. I know porn is a separate discussion. I just actually had a class about did a class.
I'm not so sure how separate a discussion pornography is, because the truth is that a lot of kids, I don't know how many kids, I can't give you statistics on how many kids are having sex. And I can't give you statistics on how many kids watch porn, but I can tell you that a lot of kids watch porn. I don't know that a lot of kids have sex, but I know that a lot of kids watch porn. And they mostly will go there because they're curious. Curiosity is a very healthy developmental step. I mean, nobody wants our kids to not be curious about things, but they don't know where to find out information about sexual health in a trustworthy fashion, in a way that they can get the information without feeling shamed. So they will go to porn to find out information because they'll Google sex and then all these things come up, a lot of things that they're not really ready or prepared to see. And it, the worst case scenario is it can be kind of traumatizing to see some of these things. But in the best case scenario, it's just giving them, like false information about what couples do or what bodies look like or how long you last or that there's
Right.
no foreplay or any of those things.
Yes, no, the whole thing is fantasy, but usually not good fantasy. It's not like a healthy fantasy. It tends to be very power oriented and very, very
Right.
not what we want our kids exposed to. Although I forget the statistics and I just talked about it. I don't know, 60-70% of guys and 30% of girls have seen
Right.
porn. And I'm talking about in the general world before they're the age, before 12.
Yeah. I mean, the statistics vary, and also the studies around the effect of pornography vary, where there are studies that, if you're prepared and you come from an environment that normalizes sexuality, watching pornography just for the sake of arousal is not necessarily going to be harmful. But if you also value your spirituality, your spiritual health, then watching porn, which is very split and not integrated with the rest of you, can be far more damaging to your sense of self. And so I think that a lot of our work as parents is being able to deal with the topic of sexuality and sexual and viewing of pornography or sexual experiences or desire, viewing them without shame. I think that one of the important aspects of development that we want to be aware of is how to, raise our children to be sexually healthy adults and not to kind of compartmentalize sexuality as something that they are ashamed of. A lot of the experience that I hear about, the experiences that I hear about, at least in America, and maybe to some extent here, is that, in high school you fool around and you have all these sexual experiences. This is like, I'm talking about like a modern Orthodox spectrum. But then you go to yeshiva and seminary and you become very flipped out and from, and you kind of split that was your old self and now is your new self, and you become all pure and you put that life behind you. So I think that is one way of experiencing your sexuality as, I'm doing something wrong now, but I'm gonna repent for it later and be a better person. And that also turns sexuality into something, that's related to being irresponsible and not quite from enough and, rebellious and all of those areas where, sexuality is not necessarily rebellion. It's not you're not necessarily a rebellious kid or a not religious kid, or a not well-behaved kid or a not ethical kid, because you're engaging in sexuality. If you're engaging in sexuality and you're doing it with ethics, with respect, with consent, enthusiastic consent and boundaries, then, you're a very good kid. You're doing everything right, except for maybe the halachic piece, which, I can't, that's just part of the value system, and you are expected to live according to that value system, but not everybody will choose to.
Right. I mean, people, even very, very from people, pick and choose what halacha they want to follow. I mean, we just know that from Lashon Hora, obesity is the highest in the Orthodox or Haredi community than any other group. So everybody does pick and choose what they follow. But yeah, it's interesting. And I love what you're saying. And I probably scored more than a 0+ on my discussions because I did talk about sexuality.
Well, I think that you should not be hard on yourself, and parents who have a hard time talking about sex and sexuality should not be hard on themselves, but I think that it's great to be aware of it and to look for sources that can be helpful. There are all sorts of courses that are going on now for how to talk to your kids about sex. And I think that, parents need to also examine their own values and attitudes about sex. I think a lot of parents are afraid to be hypocrites, because a lot of parents will remember their time as teenagers and maybe they weren't 100% Shomer all the time. And they feel like they're supposed to present the 100% Shomer approach. And they don't want their kids to ask them if they were Shomer or not, because number one, it's not any of their business, and number two, they weren't, so they don't want to admit it. So they're, and often they were, and they may not necessarily be aware of the circumstances that they grew up in might have been very different from the circumstances that their kids grow up in, and that they might make different choices for different reasons. I think that what's important is that we don't need to, I think that what we need to understand is that it's perfectly reasonable to raise our children with our values. If we believe that, premarital sex is, we don't want that because we want our kids to wait until after marriage for sex, because we believe that marital sex is, exclusive and it's special. I mean, these are all values that parents are allowed to have and to give to their kids. That's okay. Like, I think we need to acknowledge and recognize that you can do both. You can teach the values, and at the same time, you can recognize that you don't have to be afraid of sexuality. Sex is not fearful and it's not scary. It doesn't have to be. And trying to get kids to not have sex by making them afraid. Like, I like to tell the story. One time I was asked to speak at a Ulpana for 12th grade girls about why doing sexual things is dangerous. This is dangerous and that is dangerous. I mean, that's not what they asked me to come for. They asked me to come to talk about sex education to this class. And when I was there, the teacher said, well, can you explain, like, the kids were asking, they were asking about oral sex, and they were asking about different kinds of things. And the teacher said, explain to them why it's so dangerous to do these things. And I turned to the teacher and I said, you're talking about girls who are 18. Some of them will get married at 19 and a half or 20. So why is it that suddenly, after they've stood under a chuppah, these things that you want me to tell them are dangerous now?
Fine. Yeah, good
really
answer.
Not about being dangerous. It's really about how these things have to be, you have to be prepared for them. And, you have to be able to talk about, if a teenage girl is asking about oral sex, what's more interesting to me than whether or not, it's okay to do or not, which, what's important to me is, why are you choosing to do it? And what she might tell me is, well, I did it once, and I was, because my boyfriend really asked me to, and now he wants me to do it all the time. I don't really want to do it, but I feel like I have to keep doing it so that he'll stay my boyfriend. I mean, this isn't a religious issue. This is an issue.
Oh my goodness, very pervasive.
Yeah, but this is an issue of sense of self and autonomy
Boundaries.
and boundaries. I mean, so couching this in religion, whether or not you should give oral sex or not, is it halachic? Is it halachically worse than doing it with your hand or doing anything like that? I mean, that's not the point. The point is that it's your body. And you do not have to do anything that you don't want to do. And so also, like, the whole idea of asking about birth control. So if somebody is having sex or wanting to have sex and they're asking about birth control, well, I would like to know, well, what about pleasure? Are you, what about, and they might say, well, what pleasure? Like, I don't have pleasure. So why are you doing it? Again, trying to get an understanding of what is the context. Again, it's not shame-based. It's based on the principles of sexual health. It's based on the principles of, again, shared values and mutual pleasure and mutual commitment to using birth control, having a plan for what happens if I do get pregnant. Do I have a plan? Am I are we able to handle such a situation? And these are all important aspects of preparedness for a sexual relationship.
Wow. And it's probably obvious to my listeners, but I'll just ask because it's not obvious to me. So are you saying, like, as a mom, we should be speaking to our kids, and if our kid is showing some sort of interest in having sexual activity, that we actually raise all these issues? Like, are you protected? Do you have a plan if your protection falls through? Things like that? Or are you just saying our teens should have this?
It's different. Like I said, sexuality is a developmental process. You're not going to talk about all things with all kids, because
No, of course, if they're not showing any interest. Yeah.
Right. So for example, if you have a kid who is like completely showing again and is not dating and is not doing things, like it's pretty obvious that that might not necessarily be an important discussion to have about birth control with a daughter who's not engaged in these things. But if your daughter or son are coming to you and saying that they are interested in or are already engaging in sexual activity, and then yeah, you do want to talk to them about, or ask them if they have access to the information. Definitely.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Again, I think that you can separate that conversation from values. Also, you can talk about, again, autonomy and consent and mutuality and pleasure. These are all parts of it. But you can also talk about if they are able to articulate their values and their reasons for feeling that they are ready to engage.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. Wow. Lots of food for thought. So what would you tell a mom if she hasn't been up to date with having these conversations, and she is suspecting that her daughter or son is engaging in sex? I just know from the parents I coach, I know that their kids are, from what the parents are saying, that the kids are probably quite sexually active, and the parents have their heads in the sand. Should the parents have a talk about?
Yeah, look, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'm just going to say about like birth control and making sure that a baby doesn't come out of this relationship.
Well, I do think that if your kids are your kids and they're your responsibility, and even if they have chosen a different path, first of all, they don't necessarily know anything. And they don't necessarily, even if your kids are not so religious, like let's say they're quote unquote, I don't like to use off the derrick.
They chose a different path.
Chose a different path or whatever. That doesn't mean they know what they're doing. As a matter of fact, they're more likely to not know what they're doing, and because they're, let's say, not keeping Shabbat or kashrut anymore, that anything goes there too. They don't necessarily know that there are rules around sexuality that they didn't learn, because all they learned was, being shomer yichud and shomer negia. So I think that, for kids who are, not on the same religious spectrum as the parents, I think there's even more of a responsibility to ask them. But I would say to all parents, just ask your kids before you offer information. You want to just say, look, is there anything that I can help with in terms of, guiding you or giving you information? Do you have a need for information? Or, is there anything that you want to know about sex or sexuality or engaging in sex? I don't know if you're engaging in sex, but if you want to talk, can I ask if you are? Like, you want to start with some sort of acknowledgement or permission. You don't want to be too invasive, right, but you also don't want to be too avoidant, because that can be kind of abandoning. Sometimes kids really have no idea how to bring it up with parents, especially if they're not from kids from parents, and they think that how can they possibly bring up sex with their from parents, when in fact they should, because they're your parents and your parents care about you and they want to make sure that you're healthy and that you're safe, and that you are, ready to face the world.
Wow. Okay. So much food for thought. Oh my gosh. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to write myself notes of what I learned from this. This was fantastic.
Thank you.
Talli, where can people find you?
Okay, so I just started with Instagram, so look for me on
Whoa.
Instagram because that's totally new for me. I have a Facebook page. I have a website. You can find me there. I have a blog on my website. I have a book that's not for kids though; it's for married couples.
Okay,
But
that's important
it's
too.
it's a book for intimacy. But of course, anybody who wants to read it to prepare for intimate marital life is certainly invited to. I don't hold back information from single people. I think it's really important to be prepared. Yeah, you can just find me, Google me, you'll be able to find me. Thanks for
Awesome.
having me.
Thank you so much. I hope everybody enjoyed your class as much as I did. I got so much out of it. I didn't turn into a tomato. At least I hope I
Yeah.
didn't. Well, now I am.
Just a little plug for our podcast, Intimate Judaism. It's a podcast that I do monthly with Rabbi Scott Kahn. And we have spoken about our first couple episodes were about how to raise sexually healthy Orthodox daughters and sons, but we really haven't done that much about sex education. So I think you've given us an idea. So thanks for that. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to plug Intimate Judaism on this.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank
You're very
you.
welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for participating.